Coming up on this episode of the IoT Inc. Business Show.
So, what have we learned so far? In this, the 100th and 101st episode of the IoT Business Show, I look back and give you my unfiltered take on the last 60 episodes. I'll cover what I learned, how it fits into the big picture, and who would benefit from listening to the episode again or for the first time. Think of it as a Cliff Notes or a Reader's Digest summary of the last 60 hours of interview goodness in under 2 hours. The signal-to-noise ratio is quite high, so take a listen. It'll be worth your time.
All this and more on this episode of the IoT Inc. Business Show. The people, the business, and the technology of the next generation internet. This is the IoT Inc. Business Show. And now, here's your host, Bruce Sinclair.
Hello and welcome to the IoT Inc. Business Show. This show is for business leaders and managers employing the Internet of Things for their business or the business of their customers. I'm your host, Bruce Sinclair, and I interview the industry's leading authorities to find out how they use IoT to improve business and create value. If you like this show, subscribe to it on iTunes and go to iotinc.com to check out my complimentary articles, videos, meetups, and webinars.
If you're a longtime fan of the show, you're going to love this episode. Background stories, summaries of important concepts, how they fit into the big picture. What's not to like? Next up will be a mini-series on AI in IoT. I'm lining up the guests now. And on a final note, if you want to take your learning to the next level, consider becoming a certified IoT professional by checking out my ICIP online training program at www.iot-inc.com/training. If you've listened to any of the rerun episodes, you've heard all about it. Difference now is that it is publicly available. Again, for more information, that's www.iot-inc.com. Okay, on with the retrospective. Okay, we start out with episode 71, and it's called Triple Threat, the Amazon Way on IoT, and it's with the author John Rossman. And John reached out to me. This is around when his book was published. It's a popular book on IoT, and his first book was when he was written about Amazon and their business processes. And so in this book, he talks about Amazon's IoT processes. So when he reached out to me, I knew I was writing a book, so I felt like, yeah, I want to give him some publicity. And it was a good talk. It was specifically, again, on the lessons that he learned with respect to Amazon, talking about how Amazon uses IoT within their company, within their distribution plants, and also a little bit about the Dash button as well and the Amazon Echo. So we get into a number of things. This Amazon is a big player. There's no denying it. When looking at the home IoT or the consumer IoT market, and specifically around the ecosystems or who's going to win the ecosystem fight, Alexa in the last year or so has really been taking a lead. And so it's worth a listen if you're interested in Amazon and IoT. Next episode is episode 72. And it's called The IoT Overlords and Their Thirst for Your Data. It's with Johannes Ernst, and his company is called Indie Computing. Now, Johannes was a pretty outspoken member of my meetup. And I have a meetup in the Silicon Valley. It's been a little bit dormant lately. I do plan on ramping it up again. But in any case, Johannes was an early member, came to a lot of meetings. I got to appreciate his point of view, his thought processes. So I invited him on my podcast. In fact, I also invited him to speak at another conference. Oh no, it was do actually speak at my meetup, and I held it at an IoT conference. I can't remember which one now. But this is a separate interview, and as the name implies, he's kind of a rebel. He has been developing his own IoT solutions since practically being a child, so we kind of joke about that. But he does bring up some good points with respect to data and your control over your data within your home. And I try to bring it again to the business side of things and trying to understand, the lessons learned from a business perspective. But again, this is an episode that is related to privacy, more related to consumer IoT as opposed to our B2C IoT versus B2B IoT, specifically because of privacy issues. In B2B IoT, privacy issues are all written out in black and white in contracts, so it's pretty clear cut. But if you're in consumer IoT or interested in consumer IoT and privacy, then episode 72 with Johannes is a fun episode to listen to, and informative too. Episode 73 is called Prognostic Analytics versus Predictive Analytics in IoT, and it's with CEO Moritz von Platt from Cassantech. Now, I got put in touch with Moritz by Ilya, and Ilya was one of my book reviewers for my book IoT Inc., and he reviewed my analytics chapter. Now, Ilya is a PhD physicist or mathematician, one of the two, maybe both, and he's now a VC. A great guy. And he suggested, actually, it came out of the book review. So when he was one of the 3 reviewers of the analytics chapter, and he was kind of clarifying some of my thinking on predictive analytics. So this is interesting this is an interesting episode because it compares prognostic analytics with predictive analytics. Now, most people think that predictive analytics gives you a specific time when an event is going to occur. But in reality, it's not that specific. Where prognostic analytics is pretty specific in the when, deciding when something's going to happen. However, as with all mathematical techniques or data science techniques, there's pros and cons for both of them. And for prognostic analytics, you need a pretty closed system, meaning a system that has very few variables. So this is a good episode. It's a good episode if you are in asset utilization, if you are interested in obviously predictive analytics, and just understanding what prognostic analytics is. I give it a nod in my book. I do talk about it in my book, as well as my online course. And again, that's the history behind this particular episode. And again, it's a good episode with Moritz. Episode 74 is called Your IoT Journey, Taking the Right Steps. And I'm going to get the pronunciation wrong here, but it's with Marcy Krantz, and he's a VP at Cisco. Now, Marcy is also an author. He's written an IoT business book as well. And probably by hearing my episode with John from the IoT Way, his publicist, Cisco's publicist, contacted me and asked if I wanted to do an interview with Marcy. And I agreed. And the interview is interesting. We go through the concepts of what he's learned in a big company and consulting. Yeah, and to a certain extent, he's a consulting role, but selling to large companies and kind of some best practices. Now, when it came to returning the favor, I have to tell you that he didn't really reciprocate. He's a nice guy, and maybe it's policy, but I asked him also to write a preface, being, he was another IoT author, a VP at Cisco, but for I guess company policy reasons, that's what was stated. He never did do it, but that does not negate the fact that it's a worthwhile podcast. And again, it's for a big company, more if you have a big company, if you're working for a big company and selling to big companies. Most of this is with respect to operational technology. And so if that is your specific area of interest, definitely listen to episode 74. Episode 75 is called Legal Limbo, Doing IoT Business in the Gray. And it's with Ron Quirk and Alex Schneider from Marshallian and Donahue. This is another law firm. It's another legal episode. And Ron is an expert mostly in spectrum bands, but he has been expanding his I guess, expertise and his firm's expertise. He leads the firm's IoT practice with respect to regulations. And we talk about the regulations, U.S. regulations, what to look out for, specifically with the law. Now, most of these are related, again, to consumer IoT, but is very relevant. Now, later on in this podcast, I'll talk about the GDRP, the General Data Protection Regulation. I always get the last two letters mixed up. I probably got it mixed up. But this is more of a U.S. focus. So we talk about the different U.S. agencies, how they are coordinating, or maybe better way of saying it, not coordinating their efforts. And it's an eye-opener. So this is for you if you want to understand, again, the legal implications. It's got more of a U.S. perspective, but it is applicable worldwide. And that's episode 75. Episode 76 is called Untangling Security and Privacy in IoT. This is a solo podcast with just me. And as the title implies, I get into kind of trying to tangle or detangle or untangle, I guess, the difference between security and privacy. So security is a technical issue, privacy is a business issue, and often people will conflate the two. But they are different. And this is a short episode, and if you are interested in this area, specifically privacy, security, the whole realm, this is, it's a quick listen. I won't say lightweight, but it is, it's not as dense, but it gives a good overview of security and privacy, at least from my perspective. Episode 77 is another legal issue. It's called the FTC and IoT. Defending Against Zealous Tech. And it's with Jared Ho, and he is with the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission in the US. So Jared, this was an interesting episode because we're getting it from the source, and we speak to, again, the FTC's mandate, and he gives some pretty solid advice on how, basically, what's fair and what's deceptive, and how to position your IoT product, what you say about your IoT product, the data you gather with your IoT product system or environment. And looking at it again from a regulation point of view, specifically from an FTC regulation, and that's obviously a U.S. perspective. But since it is from the horse's mouth, so to speak, it is from the source, this is definitely, again, if you are dealing with security, trying to understand security, and specifically privacy is one of the risks of it, then, and that's only one of them, actually FTC has others as well, this is a good episode to listen to, episode 77. Episode 78 is called IoT Investing, Where is the Value Being Generated? Now, this is Upal Basu. Again, I met him at he was in another podcast. He was in the one I described earlier, where it was a panel and talking about value creation. So he was with Nokia Growth Partners, and it was also with Jesse de Mesa. And at the time, he was with Momenta Partners. Both investors, and this actually was a recording of one of my meetups here in the Silicon Valley. So it's a little different, but it's a panel discussion, so to speak, and it's respect to investing. And it's looking at investing in IoT from an investor's point of view. So if you're a smaller company or even a bigger company and you're raising financing, then this is a good episode to get into, at least from a VC perspective, what they're looking for, where they see value being generated, where the trends are. So again, if you are raising capital or maybe are going to be giving out capital as a VC, I have many VC listeners to this podcast, then this would be an episode to hear their perspective. Episode 79 is called IoT Analytics, Best Practices in Process Manufacturing. And it was with Peter Zornio of Emerson Automation Solutions. So I referred to this in the last podcast, and I've done a number of podcasts on discrete manufacturing, and this one is more on process manufacturing. So if you're not familiar with the differences between the two, discrete manufacturing is generally making a product that you can hold, where process manufacturing, this could be, for example, oil and gas. So it has to do with chemistry. So you're processing generally minerals from the earth and converting them into something else. So it is manufacturing, and it is by definition, clearly by definition, industrial IoT. In this episode, we talk a lot about data science and in particular analytics. Peter, it was a fun interview. He had some very good perspectives, and his perspectives on how to hire, what they do, and this is data analysts, how to sell it. They are applicable to all industries, and I learned a lot from Peter in this particular episode, and gave me a slightly different perspective on my worldview, more practical of how using data analytics can create value. Well, using the case, obviously the use case of process manufacturing, but as I said, what he says is applicable pretty much to all IoT initiatives. So analytics, you should be interested in analytics. I recommend this episode to everyone because it does go beyond process manufacturing. Episode 80 is called Dirty Data, Preventing the Pollution of Your IoT Data Lake. It's with James Brannigan of Bright Wolf. And again, this is one where they reached out to me. I didn't know Bright Wolf, although maybe we started a relationship on LinkedIn. It could have been. But I was very happy I did this interview. It fit in with where I was going at the time. And it talked about some real practical issues. And what I got from this episode, one of the main takeaways I got from this episode that I started implementing with my clients is the concept of using metadata to identify the hardware and software that's being used to collect the data. And this is almost the concept of breadcrumbs. And the reason this is important is because often there'll be problems. There'll be problems with the data, and you need to go back and use breadcrumbs, using that analogy, to find out where the problems were. And so this goes, Bright Wolf has a lot of experience, a lot of hands-on experience. So this is a very good episode to understand some practical issues with data capture, with analytics, and some of the things you can do that's relatively simple. For example, again, this metadata concept, things you can do to mitigate problems or at least help identify and then solve problems with your data analytics, your data analytics in the future. Because often there's problems, and whether they're in the hardware, whether in the software, and then if you find problems in one part of your data, if you're using the same hardware and or software for other sensors in other places, there's a probability that you have problems there as well. So great episode. That is episode 80. Episode 81 is called iRobot and IoT, taking the Roomba to the next level. So and that's with Chris Jones. I believe he's the CTO of iRobot Corporation. So very fun. I was introduced to iRobot, actually not by meeting Chris, but I met one of his colleagues, and his name escapes me now. And we just met this is one of these circumstantial meetings at a conference. We were eating, and we sat next to each other while eating our rubber chicken, so to speak. And we built up a conversation. Now, eventually, going back and forth with the iRobot company, the PR people, it took a little while to get this interview because the PR people, I guess it took a little while because they wanted Chris to be the one doing the interview. And so it was a good idea. It ended up being a very fun interview, specifically because a lot of people know about the Roomba, and it is an IoT vacuum cleaner, no doubt about it. And it's interesting because we do talk about collecting other data, and in particular, making maps of homes. And it wasn't that long after recording this episode that I read an article where iRobot was getting into trouble by capturing this data. And in particular, not disclosing that they were capturing this data, which we talked about. And I think maybe not disclosing it maybe in an obvious enough way, but we did talk about this in this episode. So this is a great episode, very fun episode. Yeah, it's consumer IoT, privacy, but it's a fun use case. The next episode is, well, I guess it's an episode without a name. It was an extra episode, and between 81 and 82. And it's an episode with me, and it's called the IoT Inc. Book Overview. So as the name implies, this must have been just after my book, IoT Inc., How Your Company Can Use the Internet of Things to Win in the Outcome Economy, was published by McGraw-Hill. And I go through the book, give a high-level summary of each chapter. So yeah, if you're interested in the book, or maybe finding out a little bit more about the book, then it's worth a listen. So a little bit promotional, I suppose, but I try to add value. And the book chapters really structure how I think about IoT. So it's a high level. You can use it for high level thinking, at least one type of perspective, and obviously it'll also be useful if you're thinking about choosing an IoT book. Episode 82, it's called Bruce Sinclair's, so it's pretty obvious. It's Bruce Sinclair's opening keynote at Insurance Nexus 2017. So this was another keynote that I delivered. It was in Chicago. As the name implies, it was for the insurance industry, so it was to all insurance people. And I actually produced a new presentation for this keynote, and I contrasted my two children. One is my daughter, who's a leadfoot, how we pay, since we pay for both their car insurance, how we pay a lot less for her, a lot more for my son, who actually drives like a granny, but he has a sports car. In any case, that was kind of the premise of the presentation, but it got into a lot of detail, and specifically disintermediation of the biggest worry that the industry has right now, that being the insurance industry, is the disintermediation of them, meaning them being cut out. And one example, so any company that has an IoT product system environment, they have a direct connection with their customer. When they have a direct connection with their customer, they can cut out a lot of the middlemen. In a certain way of thinking, you can think about insurance as a middleman, because take, for example, Tesla. And Tesla will know how you drive, whether it's good or bad. If you're a really bad driver, they're not going to offer you insurance, but they have said they are going to start offering insurance. If you're a good driver, they can offer you insurance that's far cheaper than just demographic-based insurance like what we pay for my two children. So this is a good, interesting episode. It is, again, a presentation. Also, I think there's some Q&A. There's some Q&A at the end of it. So if you're interested in insurance and IoT, and in particular just the general concept of disintermediation and how IoT will change the strategic landscape of pretty much every industry, then episode 82 is for you. Episode 83 is called IoT Inc. Book, Introduction Chapter, read by author. So that's me. And this is right when my book, IoT Inc. was coming out. And so I did a reading. I read the first chapter of the book, and that's available. It's available. There's a link to it. Obviously, it's available in the podcast. And then you can also download the first chapter. This is the introduction chapter. So this is kind of an overview. It's kind of funny. I have a few stories in it based on my first IoT consulting client. That's one of the funny stories. And you can also read the first chapter if you go to IoT-Inc.com. You can download it. And what else can you get from the book? Yeah, let's see if it's for you. In any case, this is it's a fun episode. It gives, again, a worldview, my worldview on IoT. So listen to it if you're potentially interested in my book. The book actually is doing really well, and I just received an email from my publisher yesterday or day before that it's being published in Portuguese. And that's after Korean and Chinese. So that's 4 different languages so far. Episode 84 is the start of a mini-series on the digital twin. Now, what I noticed when I went to my website, and I classify, and I've mentioned it in the previous podcast, and I think in this podcast, where you can slice and dice the content in a lot of different ways if you go to IoT-Inc.com, IoT-Inc.com. And I noticed that while the digital twin was a huge part of my book, I had very little or very few interviews that mentioned it. So I decided to flush out the concept even further than I did in the book, and it's all in the course now, and interview the top digital twinners, and yeah, that's a word, in the industry. Now, I'm not a big fan of the term digital twin, but just like smart product or connected product, I think I have to just come to terms with it. That is the term that's being used, and so I use it. Digital twin, the reason I don't like it is because it kind of implies a physical representation of something, because a twin, look-alike, as opposed to the actual functionality. So the first interview, episode 84, is called "Producing the Digital Twin for the Industrial Internet of Things." It's with Dmitry Volkman of GE Digital, and he's definitely got some very good perspectives. We go through the definition, what a digital twin is, in particular, the two parts of it, the data and the models, and the different types of data and the different types of models. Episode 85, also on the digital twin, is called "Modeling the Raw Data to Create IoT's Digital Twin." And it is with Arnulf Hagen of Fedem Technology. And Fedem Technology was purchased, before this podcast, it was purchased by SAP. And I was put on to Arnulf by SAP. And it was an interesting interview. Now, what I got from this interview was that they were using finite element analysis as their main modeling type. And this brings up the question, there are meta models and there are models. And the meta models are going to be like a FEM model. And the second type of model are going to be stochastic models. And these are models, they're statistical models. So they are basically coming up with representations of raw data and representing the data in raw data. And meta models are higher level. For example, an example of a meta model, and I do use this in the course, is a spring. Just a very, very simple spring. But even, the meta model for a spring is F equals Kx. But in the real world, that doesn't even come close to how a spring operates. So you need to create a stochastic model. So in any case, this episode is a good one to understand the different types of models, and in particular, the meta models around a digital twin. Episode 86 is the third in the Digital Twin series. It's called The Digital Twin and Its Relationship to the AEP IoT Platform. It's with Jason Shern and Jeff Miller of PTC. And as the name implies, we talk about the relationship between the digital twin and the IoT platform. Now, the AEP platform is a certain classification of IoT platforms, and it stands for Application Enablement Platform. So when thinking about this, there are two areas that you need to consider for development as being very high on your priority list. The first being the application code, and the second being the digital twin or the analytics. So AEPs, Application Enablement Platforms, have the application code development environment generally built into them. And furthermore, you can do things like rules engines and so forth with point-and-click interfaces. Certain IoT platforms, and PTC's ThingWorks platform is one of them, allows you to develop the digital twin within the platform environment or development environment. So just like you can develop an application with point and click and also using programming libraries and APIs, the same thing is with the digital twin, again for a certain subset of IoT platforms, again with doing point and click type operations. And so a lot of the functionality in a platform like this is trying to take the place to a certain extent of a data scientist and trying to make it a little bit more easy to use by choosing the different models to apply, seeing how well they work, choosing a different model to apply, almost like the metaphor of choosing models off of a store shelf and then seeing how close they apply to the data. But in any case, this is a good episode to listen to if you are considering an IoT platform, and in particular looking at one that will help you develop both your application and, very important, your digital twin. Now, you may have another strategy for doing this. You may have a completely different development environment, as we'll see in the next podcast. You could be using something like MathWorks, but in any case, if you want to look at it from a platform point of view, 86 is a podcast for you to listen to. Episode 87 is called Breaking Down and then Building Up IoT's Digital Twin. It's with Jim Tung, and he is from MathWorks. He's one of the original MathWorks employees. And actually, this is one of the, I think, only 2 times this has happened. Although I was having podcast recording problems for a certain period of time there where the quality wasn't that great. But it's only really happened 2 times when we had to actually redo the podcast. And this is one of those 2 times. And, you know, these podcasts, you never try to reproduce them. They just go where at least for me anyway, it's not scripted, and so it just goes where the conversation ends up going. But I think this one ended up turning out better having done it a second time with Jim. Mostly because he was able to think through certain issues. I was pressing him on internal mathematical representations that MathWorks used, and so this is a very good episode if you want to go a little bit deeper in terms of modeling, how the models are built, how you do it within a platform like MathWorks. So that's episode 87. Episode 88 was interesting, and it's called The Emergence of the IoT Cognitive Digital Twin, and it's with Ahmed El Adel. And he, at the time, and I think he still is with Accenture. Now, this introduces the concept of a cognitive digital twin. And so what does that mean? Well, the digital twin, again, consists of 2 parts. It consists of the data and the models. And the data has raw data and metadata. And the models have raw models and meta models. Now, within the raw models, and you could just eliminate the word raw. So within the models, there's different types of models. Generally, up to this point in the podcast, and generally up to this point in my thinking as well, I've been considering only analytical models. The podcast with Ahmed was interesting because I saw actually his post on LinkedIn. And then I reached out to him. But it's interesting because it starts bringing in the concept of using AI for certain types of models. So again, how the model, what's underneath the model differs. You know, from an analytical model to an AI model. An AI model is built more on analytics. Is you go through, and I like the analogy of you have to bring out the rulers, and you need to measure things, and you need to derive everything from basics, whereas an AI model, as opposed to an analytical model, has knowledge. And so the analogy is you look at a bridge and you can have a junior engineer, which would be, let's say, the analytical model, would have to do all the measurements, bring out all their textbooks, go to the web, make decisions analytically, and then decide whether the bridge, let's say, was safe or not. Whereas an AI model, the analogy would be a very experienced engineer just has to look at it, and since he or her has seen this many times before, they would be able to just say, yeah, no, based on my experience, I can tell, we need to do let's say a revamp on the bridge. So that's probably not that great of an analogy, but this just brings in the concept of using artificial intelligence for certain types of models. Now, artificial intelligence is good for very specific problems, especially ones that you're mapping an X to a Y. And so we can't use it in all cases, but I will be going into a lot more detail on artificial intelligence to a certain extent based on this podcast. I'm just sort of getting these thoughts going to dissect it. But listen to episode 88 if you want to start thinking about artificial intelligence in IoT. And this is one of the areas of artificial intelligence in IoT, and that is developing models and for the digital twin. So episode 88, good place to start for AI and IoT. Episode 89 is called The Profound Impact of IoT Digital Twins in the Supply Networks, or in Supply Networks. It's with Lane Warshaw and Aaron Parrott from Deloitte Consulting. And in this case, we talk more on a specific use case, and that again is, as the name implies, supply networks and supply chains, and using the digital twins to streamline and make them more efficient. This is a good tag team. We have Lane, who is the PhD, so very technical, and we have Aaron, who's more on the business case. And one of the interesting things we speak about in episode 89 is the whole area of standardization for digital twins. This is in addition to the supply chain, so it's just one of my takeaways. And right now, the digital twin, it's hard enough to come up with a definition for it, let alone a standard for it. But I believe once there is more of a standard digital twin, then this will be something that will be used more often. Now, it's not just that it'll be used more often. More importantly, is you'll be able to intermix digital twins from different authoring environments. Now, whether these authoring environments are point and click, which aren't that many, or they're more programming environments, again, the end result is going to be the digital twin. Now, you want to be able to, ideally, what you want to be able to do is develop your digital twin independent of the platform or the development environment. And I do talk about this again in the PTC podcast as well. And the reason you want to separate them and you don't want them intertwined is because you want to be able to drop your digital twin into different applications. And a good analogy here is, let's say, a video game. And the video game has characters, and let's say it's a basketball video game, and the characters have a certain capability, a certain personality. They can jump this far, they can jump this high, they can make these type of 3 shots. They can, they're aggressive. Well, this is all information that would be stored in the digital twin. However, that's just the information, again, the models and the data on the character. To be able to play a game, you need to drop that character into different applications. So similarly, for being able to do a simulation using the digital twin, let's say it's a digital twin of a dryer, one of my go-to examples, then you want to be able to drop that digital twin of the dryer into different types of applications. Those applications being maybe one application to be running in real time, one application to be looking into the future, and again, or a completely different application from a different customer. And so a different manufacturer. So being able to independently develop a digital twin and have it be able to be dropped into different applications, so think about like environments or simulations, the only way you're going to be able to do that is with standardization. So we're a little ways yet, but that's one of the takeaways, one of my takeaways for you listening is when you do develop your digital twin, make sure that it's not intertwined with the application that then runs it. Make sure it's separate, and that means developing it in a separate way, because then you'll be able to use it down the line. You'll be able to use it in more ways than if it's hard-coded within a specific application. That's the end of our digital twin series. It was a series, I believe, of 6 podcasts. And then we move into the area of GDPR. So this is the General Data Protection Regulation. And this is coming. It's going to be coming on, very soon now from the time that I'm recording this podcast, but May 25th, 2018. So I believe I do 2 podcasts. The first one is called, and this is episode 90, and it's called the GDPR, Defining the Future of IoT Data Privacy. And it's with Rosie Burbridge of Fox Williams. Fox Williams is a legal firm that's based in the UK. And actually, I met Rosie during my book tour. When I was in London, I spoke at the London meetup, IoT meetup, and Rosie was also speaking at that same meetup. So we got to know each other, and then I invited her on the show. And quite frankly, up until the time I was in Europe for my book tour, it really wasn't on my radar, and I don't know if it's on your radar, but the GDPR is important. And the reason it's important is even though it's just but it is a European or EU regulation or regulatory bundle, it will have effects worldwide. And the reason is it's not just for EU companies, it's for companies that sell to EU citizens. And so unless your company does not sell to Europe, which is quite possible, it could be a smaller company, then you don't have to worry about it. But if it's a larger company and you may have European citizens using your IoT product, system, or environment, then it's important that you understand all the details of the GDPR and understanding what you need to do technically to be able to meet those regulations. So this was an illuminating episode with Rosie, and that is episode 90. Episode 91 is called that's the second in the mini-series on GDPR. It's called the GDPR is Coming Fast, What You Should Do First. And it's with fellow Canadian Chris Parham, and he's with File Facets. And I guess the main message that comes out of this podcast, and I've covered privacy quite a bit in my book, and obviously, or maybe not obviously, but it's also covered in a lot of detail in the online training program, the ICIP online training program. So it's not really a big surprise. It wasn't really necessarily a big surprise to me, but Chris's point that he made, and one of the main points that I remember, after all this time, is that what the GDPR is asking for is really not a big burden to bear, because it's really what you should be doing anyway. And to a certain extent, the point that he makes is that the GDPR is really defining best practices. Now, just to separate privacy, which is the GDPR is mostly focused on, and security. Let's first again make the note that privacy is a subset of risk. It's just one form of risk. However, GDPR, because it's based on B2C IoT, so it's based on consumers who don't have their lawyers to sign contracts with the IoT companies that they do business with. If you're just buying, let's say, a smart speaker, that's why the government steps in. Now, as I said earlier in this podcast, I did talk to a number of U.S. firms and even the FTC themselves, and they have a different perspective. But the European perspective is really not really any different. If you break out, so as I was saying, so we've got the business side, which is privacy, and then privacy is a subset of risk, so that's really the business side. Then we have cybersecurity, which is the technical side. Getting back to best practices, as Chris pointed out in this podcast, pretty much all countries have the same best practices because, well, they are the best practices. And so it's not like one country or a region like Asia or North America or Europe is ahead or behind another region or country on privacy issues and cybersecurity issues. We all kind of know what we need to do. The difference with the GDPR is going to be that it's going to be prosecuted and it's going to be enforced. At least that's the strong messaging that's coming out of the EU. They're hiring people to do this, and so that's the secondary point that Chris makes is that all countries. It's not like the EU is ahead on their thinking in terms of on one side the technical side, so they've got their recommendations for technology and they have the recommendations for privacy, just like any other region and every other country has. The difference being the prosecution. So again, the two main points being GDPR, you should bone up on it, understand it, for a couple of reasons. One, if you're international, it's going to affect your business. And two, it just really defines very clearly the best practices on the privacy side. So get to know it. That's episode 91, again with Chris Parham. Now we get into blockchain. So I've been doing this, and I kind of like it, and I'll be doing it again. After this podcast is over, there might be a couple intermediary podcasts if I can't get the right guests lined up, but I'll be doing it again for AI. And so just like I did for the digital twin, and there not being a lot of information on it, so I did a mini-series on it. I did a mini-series on GDPR. Now we're about to start the next mini-series, and that's on blockchain and IoT. And generally when I do this, it's because either there isn't enough information out there on the topic. So that was the case of the GDPR. And I found that I wrote that was the case for the digital twin. So I found that I wrote a lot about it in my book, and I covered it in my course, but there's not a lot of information on it. So I wanted to, I guess, spread the word to a certain extent. With GDPR and blockchain, the second reason I'm doing these mini-series and why I'm doing it with AI is because I want to learn. And these are two areas that I didn't find I was far enough along to be able to advise my clients and to be able to write about it and advise you on the podcast and as I do with my articles and so forth. And so that's why I did the GDPR. Now I feel pretty comfortable about the GDPR, and why I did the blockchain. And the big overarching question, and I'm not going to answer it quite yet, but the big overarching question for blockchain was whether we should be paying attention to it now for business reasons. So can it transact business for us now? And if not, when should it? So I started this mini-series with Jessica Groupman. I've known Jessica for a long time. We're friends, and we bump into each other all the time at different IoT conferences. She's with, and she was newly started her own firm, Kaleido Insights. And the name of the podcast is Blockchain and IoT, the Advent of Truthful Data. And this is one of the key aspects of blockchain, is defining truth. Now, as we went through this series, so this episode is a good one, and I wanted to start with Jessica because it gives you the basics. So what is blockchain? How does it apply to IoT? What are the main technologies? What's its strengths? What's its weaknesses? And so episode 92 is a great way to sort of just start, and just like I did, start getting yourself familiar with blockchain and how it applies to IoT. Episode 93, again, is on blockchain, and it's called the Trusted IoT Alliance, Standardizing Blockchain for IoT. And this was Zaki Manian of the Trusted IoT Alliance. Now, Zaki, it's kind of funny. He's a real technical guy, and I tried pushing him to go more technical, but he resisted. He was recommended to me by a couple different people, and that's kind of often what I'll do, is if there's an area I'm not that familiar with, I will reach out to a few of my contacts. I may go in my database if you sign up, for example. If you haven't signed up on iot-inc.com, to get my newsletter and articles and so forth, then what I do there is you can do a short form, which is really just your email address and your name, and then I think whether or not you are building an IoT solution for yourself or to sell. But if you fill out the long form, then that allows you to access all the material I have. So it's all the transcripts from all the podcasts and the videos and different special reports. But if you do that, then I ask a little bit more data, and part of the data I ask is, where your company's focused and so forth. So I also then, that's a long-winded way of saying, another way that I find guests for the podcast is to go through people that have signed up for my newsletter with the long form, because I know more about their company. And I'll be doing that actually as well for AI. I'll be looking through, I guess, my audience, and for people in my audience who have signed up anyway on my website. So the reason I'm telling you this is, if you haven't signed up, it might be beneficial just to let me know who you are, because it's one of the way I plumb it. Getting back to plumb for guests for podcasts and videos and so forth, and articles. So getting back to Zaki and the Trusted IoT Alliance, Zaki gave us some real good understanding on, and it started opening up the area of distributed ledger technology. They call it DLTs. So how it works. Now, one of the things I was trying to get my head around that I think is confusing is this whole concept of mining. And that is really solving these hash equations for doing cryptography as a method of validation for the blockchain. So I'm not going to get into it in detail here, but the podcast with Zaki, he's obviously very knowledgeable. He's been in the business for a long time, and he clarifies the technology. I try pushing him a little bit deeper. He doesn't really go there, but it's deep enough to go one layer or one level further than my discussion with Jessica in episode 92. Episode 94. All right, so this is the first podcast where I actually apologize for the signal to noise ratio. Now, Dave Schneider, no offense to Dave, great guy. He reached out to me, so that sometimes happens, and it sometimes works. And as I said earlier, mostly it's press people that reach out to me on behalf of their clients, and 99 times out of 100 it doesn't work because I have an editorial calendar for my podcast. I have a vision for the podcast where I want it to go, and so forth. But sometimes individuals reach out to me. That has more effect, and again, it has to kind of fit. Well, in this case, Dave Schneider, he's from the Silicon Valley, as I am right now, and he came up through a group that I presented to, he presented to, and people were very ecstatic about his presentation. So the name of the podcast is episode 94 is Trust and Disintermediation, Improving IoT with Blockchain with Dave Schneider of 42 Tech. So getting back to the apology, I don't want to waste your time, and I think I can say out of the 100 podcasts, and then there's those 3 extra ones, but let's just say the 100 podcasts, that I'm pretty proud of 95% of them. Where I believed I left you with something of value that you can't get anywhere else. And so some golden nuggets, at least one good one that you can take away from listening to the podcast. However, I didn't feel that way with 94, and I actually apologize for it. And unfortunately, anyway, I'm not going to get into details, but you can listen to it. I don't necessarily recommend wasting your time. Not wasting your time. I don't recommend spending your time listening to podcast 94 because it didn't really add that much value. Maybe I'm too hard, and actually I had a few people write back to me on this one and say, "No, you're being too hard on yourself, or being too hard on things. It wasn't that bad." Anyway, I thought it was kind of that bad. Next episode was episode 95, and that was titled, "Is Blockchain Ready to Transact IoT Business?" It was with Rianne Lewis of CountMyCrypto.com. That's just one of her companies. And Rianne was good because we went through, and I found her actually through my investigation, and she had some really good case studies. So what I wanted to do at this point with the podcast or the mini-series on blockchain was to give some case studies, to say how it was applied and used in different scenarios. And so that's the main focus of 95, definitely worth a listen, and for case studies. And again, the overarching question I was trying to answer the whole time was whether or not IoT was ready to transact business. And basically at this point, the answer was no. And it really is still no. I don't believe that it is ready to transact business today. I think there's still, the net of it is, I don't think, unless you want to make this a pet project and you're just super interested in the technology, if you're looking at blockchain from a business perspective and being able to help you transact business, it's not ready. And I don't even think it's going to be ready for 3, maybe 4, maybe even 5 years. So that's the net. And that's how I kind of left things with episode 95. But then I can't remember how it came around, but it took me to I added one more episode to the series, and that was episode 96, and it's called More Scalable Blockchain Alternatives to Transact IoT Business. So this was with Ashish Mehta. He's with the Cloud Security Alliance, and don't let the name fool you. The Cloud Security Alliance is all in blockchain. And this was a very good episode. And I definitely, if there's one episode maybe you want to listen to in all of the blockchains, if you haven't listened to them already, then I would listen to episode 96. And the reason is that Ashish is technical enough that we can talk about the weaknesses and the strengths. But then he brings up distributed ledger technology. It came up in other interviews, and I did talk about it previous to this, but effectively what this episode says is, blockchain, blockchain being the technology behind Bitcoin, for example, it's not ready for business. It's just not there yet. However, there are other blockchain-like technologies, distributed ledger technologies, that are a lot closer. I'm not saying they are there yet, but they are much, much closer than blockchain. And that's what we discussed, the different, I won't say competing, but maybe they are competing technologies to be able to do distributed ledger and really establish trust within using blockchain. So that is episode 96, and I definitely recommend listening to this episode. Okay, that was episode 101. Obviously an excellent and symmetrical number. If you've been enjoying this podcast, subscribe. That way you get every episode delivered to your mobile device. And there are 3 ways you can support this podcast. The first way is you can share it on your blog, either that's your personal blog or your company blog if you think others will find it valuable. And you can share it on social. Just go to any of the show analysis notes pages. They're all on iotinc.com, and there's a social widget there. And you can leave a rating or review on iTunes. Just go to www.iot-inc.com/iTunes. It only takes 1 click, and that's for a rating, or a little bit longer if you want to leave your thoughts for a review. I'm your host, Bruce Sinclair. Thank you for listening. Until next time, may your path to IoT business be a retro one.
You have been listening to the IoT Inc. Business Show.